Have you ever wondered what would have happened if Luffy was trained by some of One Piece's biggest losers? Would he become the weakest pirate in history? Or would these so-called losers accidentally create one of the strongest versions of Luffy ever? For example, if Luffy was trained by Trebol, a lot of terrible things would happen. For starters, I'll assume Luffy ended up in Trebol's care at a young age before he ever got his devil fruit powers. Possibly around the same time as when Doflamingo met Trebol. We all know how that story goes. Doflamingo goes crazy, kills his father, blah blah blah. But in this timeline, with the influence of Trebol, Luffy would be the one to save Doflamingo from being burned alive by the people of the island. He would then give Doflamingo the gun to kill his father and traumatize Corazon. You must remember that Trebol is not a nice dude. He's the person who created Doflamingo's twisted worldview. So it's safe to say he would do the same to Luffy, brainwashing him into being a sadistic, cruel kid. This would later backfire, but we'll get to that in a bit. Luffy would then grow up as the leader of the Don Quixote family. Well, in this timeline, it'd be known as the Monkey family. Trebol, Doflamingo, and Luffy would become super close, causing chaos and violence wherever they went. Trebol would even teach Luffy the cruel ways of the underworld at an early age. Seeing how evil and sadistic Luffy has become, Trebol would offer the string fruit to him and not Doflamingo. This would make Luffy ridiculously strong, as he was already well trained in hockey prior to receiving the fruit. Luffy would learn to master this fruit to its fullest extent, even surpassing original Dofi. It's important to note that in this timeline, Luffy would be absolutely terrifying. He would have no moral compass and smile a lot less than in the original story. With Trebol and the Monkey family's help, Luffy would do all the things that Doflamingo did in the main story, like take over Dressrosa, kill innocent people, and all sorts of wicked things. They would also find a young helpless kid named Trafalgar D. Law. Law would trust Luffy instantly, seeing as they share the same D initial in their names. They would form a close bond, and Luffy would even help Law and Corazon get the Ope no Mi and heal his sickness. Another change to the main story would be that Corazon never dies on the island trying to save Law, because Luffy would never want the Ope no Mi. I believe he wouldn't have an interest for it. This means the family would have Corazon and Law as prime members. But this is where the story would take a dark turn. This Luffy would become so powerful at the age of 17, even Trebol's brainwashing wouldn't be able to contain him much longer. He would become a rising warlord candidate before the age of 17, and eventually Trebol would try to use Luffy as a puppet the same way he used Doflamingo. But unlike Dofi, Luffy would kill him instantly. But in the end, he and the rest of the family would eventually be thrown in jail after Corazon would snitch to the world government about all their evil doing, only sparing Law. Wow, that timeline took a tragic turn. It's crazy that Luffy being raised by Trebol would make him so evil. Okay, but what would have happened if Luffy was raised by Foxy the Silver Fox? First of all, let me tell you this scenario would be absolutely hilarious. Foxy is a professional loser, but he is also a genius at cheating, tactics, mind games, distraction techniques, and psychological warfare. And his parenting style would be no different. And I believe with him raising Luffy, he would teach him all of this and more. Luffy would grow up being a very cheeky kid, using trickery, illusions, and cheap shots to outsmart adults. Growing up on Foxy's ship, Luffy would adopt Foxy's cocky attitude and would even see himself as extremely good-looking, similar to Foxy. Obviously, Luffy wouldn't have the gum fruit, but he would become a very skilled boxer, seeing as Foxy was a professional boxer before becoming a thieving pirate. At the age of 17, Luffy would leave Foxy's ship in order to start his own crew, which he would build up by winning Davy back fights, something he picked up from Foxy. Although this crew would be much more goofier than the original Straw Hats and even more stupid, often sucking up to Luffy whenever an opponent hurt his ego or called him ugly. They would often break into dance and celebrate each time they won a Davy back fight. Luffy would gain tremendous fame throughout the first half of the Grand Line as the famed captain of the Luffy Pirates. Yes, Luffy would name his crew after himself, perks of being raised by a self-absorbed pirate. The Marines would obviously take note of this and give Luffy a bounty of 100 million berries, similar to what he had during the original Long Ring, Long Land arc. The real question is, would Luffy even be stronger enough to go to the Grand Line? Well, no. Luffy would only know one fighting style, which is boxing, and would have no clue how to even use hockey. Eventually, he would get hunted by the Marines for trying to Davy back fight a Marine ship, something cocky Luffy would definitely try to do. In this timeline, Luffy was too busy trolling the entire world rather than finding the One Piece. But what would happen if Bon Clay raised Luffy? Well, first of all, if Luffy somehow ended up being raised by Bon Clay, we can assume he would be treated in the best way possible, probably buying him loads of flamboyant gifts. Luffy would would grow up around Alabasta, seeing as 𝒂𝒆𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒓 is a member of 𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄𝒄. But he really wouldn't have any meaningful connections with any of the members besides 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄. Luffy would go on missions with 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄, where he would teach him all the ways of the organization, and even give Luffy a few lessons in 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄 Kenpo, a fighting style that combines acrobatic kicks and sometimes punches with ballet dancing. This would make Luffy a formidable opponent, similar to Sanji's strength during Alabasta. Luffy would adopt 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄's weird outfits, paired with his original free laughing spirit. 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄 would treat Luffy not as his son, but as a little brother, best friend, and dance partner. Similar to 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄, Luffy would be extremely loyal and selfless in this timeline. Since the Straw Hats don't exist in this timeline, 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄 would never have to kill Mr. 3 for failing to eliminate the Straw Hats, and would just stick to helping Luffy get stronger and eventually join 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄. The entire Alabasta arc would also never happen. Over time, Luffy would be finally strong enough to join 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄 as Mr. 13. Eventually, 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄 would take over Alabasta, with Luffy playing a pivotal role in this, capturing Cobra and identifying Vivi as Miss Wednesday. Crocodile would give Luffy a promotion as Mr. 2.0, an extension of 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄, and would be seen as the third strongest member of 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄𝒄. This was the Luffy who would excel in observation haki and be a master of disguise. He would briefly meet Ace in Alabasta, and they would have an instant bond, as if they knew each other in another life. Ace would give Luffy his Viver card so that he can always find him. Eventually, the organization would fall by the Marines, just like the main story, and they would all be thrown in Impel Down. During this time, Ace would also be captured and soon to be executed. Hearing of this, Luffy planned to break out of Impel Down with the help of 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄 and Ivankov to save his friend, eventually arriving on the battlefield alongside his mentor and best friend, 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄. And in a miraculous turn of events, Luffy and 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒄 would save Ace. With Luffy being much smarter in this timeline and a master of disguise and deception, he would sneak Ace out of the battlefield before anyone could notice. Everything else in Marineford would remain the same as in the original story. Luffy would later start his own crew with �𝒂𝒄𝒄 and even have a bounty of 1 billion berries, as the government saw his rescue of Ace as a great crime to order and justice. Luffy would later learn he has Conqueror's Haki and would hone this skill along with learning Armament Haki from Ace. Just like the main story, Luffy would become a great pirate with his crew being named the strongest of the new generation. But would this Luffy be as strong as the original Luffy? Not quite, but he would be smarter. Man, who would have guessed this scenario would end so well? But now it's time for the part of the video you've all been waiting for. What would have happened if Luffy was raised by One Piece's biggest loser, Buggy? If Luffy somehow ended up in Buggy's care, it's safe to assume nothing would go smoothly. For starters, Buggy is not responsible, not very clever, and he is definitely not mentally prepared to raise a child who punches Sea Kings. But there is something people forget. Buggy sailed with Roger. He sailed with Shanks. He survived the Grand Line. And despite being terrified 99% of the time, the man simply does not die. That alone already makes him a better parent than you'd expect. As a parent, Buggy would tell Luffy all sorts of stories, some true, some false, about his journey with the Roger Pirates, and how he survived the Grand Line. He would also tell Luffy that he was so close to seeing the One Piece if it wasn't for him falling sick, which Luffy clowned him for. Luffy would be so intrigued by these stories that he would promise to be a great pirate and find the One Piece for Buggy, which would make Buggy feel a little weird, but deep down inside, he would be proud. Luffy would also be really interested in one of the pirates Buggy told him about while he was part of the Roger Pirates. Obviously, I'm talking about Shanks. Luffy would look up to him and want to meet him someday, which would give him motivation to train hard. Growing up, Luffy would be surrounded by treasure maps, failed get-rich schemes, muggy balls exploding at the wrong time, and Buggy screaming every 5 minutes. But this environment would accidentally create a very different kind of Luffy. Smarter, because he'd have to solve every problem Buggy creates. Craftier, because Buggy relies on trickery and theatrics. Strangely observant, because surviving Buggy's ship requires awareness of flying knives, cannonballs, and limbs floating around. Luffy would also learn showmanship, which boosts intimidation. Kind of like how Usopp acts bold even when he's scared. So ironically, this Luffy would actually be pretty smart for a kid. But what about his strength? Would Luffy be as weak as Buggy, or would he be even stronger than him? Well, first off, Buggy would not give Luffy a devil fruit. Why? Because Buggy is traumatized by fruits thanks to Shanks. So this version of Luffy is fruitless for most of his early life. And because he has no fruit, he actually focuses more on Haki, which he accidentally learned thanks to the luck that runs through Buggy's entirely life. It would rub off on Luffy. Something to note here is that Luffy would be an extremely lucky person, with a lot of things simply just always going his way. Buggy would also teach Luffy some acrobatics and weapon fighting, which Luffy would mix with what he thought Shanks' fighting style would be, which means this Luffy becomes more like a hybrid of Buggy and Shanks, which would annoy Buggy. He wouldn't understand why Luffy looked up to Shanks so much. But what can he do? At the age of 17, Luffy would decide to leave Buggy and start his own crew, with a goal to find the One Piece and show it to Buggy. By this point, Luffy would be much stronger than the original Luffy during the East Blue. He would already know armament and observation haki. Surprisingly, Luffy's first mate would actually be Usopp, as he heard from Buggy that Shanks has an incredible sniper on his crew. Luffy's entire crew setup would be modeled around Shanks's crew, and similar to original Luffy, he'd want his crew to be strong as well as funny, so he would seek the famous pirate hunter Zoro. At first, Zoro would not want to join the crew, but then Luffy would show him his incredible strength and haki, which would impress Zoro enough to eventually join the crew. I believe Luffy's crew wouldn't really change from the main story, as he still looks up to Shanks and wants his crew exactly like his. The first half of the Grand Line would be pretty easy for the crew, as Luffy would be way stronger than most enemies they faced, and knowing haki early on really helped. Along the way, they would pick up Robin, Brook, and Frankie. He would teach every crew member armament and observation haki too. Luffy would also be way more goofier than in the original story, and often play pranks on Zoro and Sanji. His crew would be named after his beloved mentor Buggy and his idol Shanks. Mixing the red from Shanks' crew name and Buggy's prominent nose, he would come up with the name the Red Nose Pirates. Obviously, Nami would think this is an awful name, but what can she do? After reaching the 𝑴𝒂𝒆𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒓 archipelago, Luffy and the Red Nose Pirates would be attacked by the world government, similar to the original story. But this time, they'd come out alive and even take down a few pacifistas in Sentomaru. Remember, the entire crew already knows haki, including the weakling trio, so they definitely much stronger than the original Straw Hats. Kizaru would even clash with Luffy for a while, and that's when Luffy would unlock Conqueror's haki. Kizaru would be taken back by this, and in that moment, Luffy would escape with his crew unarmed. But would this version of the Straw Hats be capable enough to save Ace during Marineford? I think yes. I mean, they all know haki, which would be so beneficial in fighting strong Marines. So in this timeline, I think Ace would be saved as well as Whitebeard. The rest of the story would play out similar to the main story, but with the crew defeating all their enemies much quicker than usual. They would make quick work out of Horty Jones, Caesar the Clown, Doflamingo, Katakuri, without even needing the time skip. Luffy's luck would carry him all the way to defeating Kaido, after a few tries of course, and become one of the strongest non-devil fruit users the world has ever seen, some even comparing him to Shanks in terms of mastery of haki. He would be named a Yonko, and be on track to becoming the Pirate King and finding the One Piece to show his mentor Buggy what it even is. Click this video if you want to know what would have happened if the current Straw Hats were at Marineford. Come on, click it!